Hey everyone, me Kevin here. In this video, I'm going to react to Peter Schiff on the Joe Rogan podcast. And we're going to review what Peter Schiff believes about our government, about money, about stimulus, and our economy. Peter Schiff manages money. He's a wealth manager. And when I first heard of Peter Schiff a few years ago, it was when he had a viral video interviewing Occupy Wall Street protesters, walking around saying he's the 1%. And wanted to talk to the 99% who were occupying Wall Street. Peter Schiff says that Wall Street is not to blame and that the government is responsible for the despair of the 90%. Well, Peter Schiff was just interviewed on the Joe Rogan podcast. They had a 3-hour podcast. We're gonna keep this video way shorter than that, but I will link this or their video down below. Instead, here I'm going to give you an overview of what Peter said, as well as include some of my thoughts. Just so you know who the heck I am, I'm a 28-year-old millennial. I spent 3 years working minimum wage, and now I control over $10 million worth of real estate and over $5 million worth of stocks. Having gone from a bottom 1%er to now in the upper 1%, I feel I might have a unique perspective to share. But most importantly, I really want to focus on summarizing what Peter Schiff's thoughts are. Now, full disclaimer, I do not agree with everything that Peter Schiff says, but I do like to listen to everyone, even if they have a different perspective, just to see if there are little things that I could learn about how different angles think about things. This is really just a summary of that. I don't want anybody to think that I 100% align with Peter Schiff, because let me tell you this, if you like Trump, you won't like Peter Schiff. If you like Joe Biden, you probably won't like Peter Schiff. I think Peter Schiff has himself narrowed into a very small audience. I mean, I think that's what happens when you bag on both potential presidential candidates. You're left with like 1% of people. But he does say some things that make you think. And I want to condense that 3 hours into like 22 minutes. Let's get started. First, Peter Schiff says that he lives in Puerto Rico, and he says he lives there mostly to avoid taxes. In Puerto Rico, he pays taxes in Puerto Rico and doesn't have to pay the federal government their taxes, which can be between 25 to 37, 38%. Instead, he pays somewhere between 4 to 7% on taxes of his income, which means if he makes $1 million, he keeps $960,000 of it, approximately. On the other hand, I live in California, which is a very high-tax state. If I make $1 million, I have to pay about $510,000 to the government in taxes. That leaves me with $490,000, or less than half. Peter Schiff believes that when you give more than 50% of your revenue to the government owns your business. You don't own your business. And that's why Peter, in part, moved to Puerto Rico. Peter states he voted for Trump to help drain the swamp, but instead, Peter is upset that Trump increased the debt ceiling, increased the national debt $6 trillion, and ended up deepening the swamp in Peter's mind. Peter thinks that this is actually going to punish Donald Trump in the next election, and that the government should be reduced in size and not increased in size. Peter argues that Trump got elected because he spoke the truth about the economy, that the economy was phony and propped up by funny money, and that resonated with a lot of people who were struggling to get ahead. When Trump ran, everything was about how terrible Obama's economic policies and economic numbers were, and about how fake they were. Then Peter Schiff says that Trump inherited those numbers, and now Trump created the best economy. Peter believes these shifts, whether or not you like Donald Trump, will lead the masses to try to elect Joe Biden, whom Peter Schiff doesn't endorse, and instead joked that if he would run for president, he'd be the only person who would get elected but not be able to vote for himself. That's because you can't vote for president in Puerto Rico. You also don't have congressional representation. But Peter Schiff then argues that things under Joe Biden would be even worse because we would have bigger government and even more taxation, and it would most importantly impact the 99% of people who are trying to get ahead, the middle class. Peter Schiff sets himself up as somebody who is out to help the middle class individual get ahead. Schiff then argues that the current bailouts of businesses, big corporations often, and big businesses are a complete fraud. That it's not fair that over 600 hedge funds got bailed out by the government while the people are suffering. Why are the rich getting richer? And they're incentivized to lie to take advantage of that free money. Now, I'm going to interject here. The Paycheck Protection Program is what Peter Schiff is referring to. It allows you to take out a loan to cover 65% of your payroll expenses and up to 35% for operating expenses. The only requirement is that you certify that you need the money to stay in business. However, all loans under $2 million are deemed to have been made in good faith, per Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. So if you have a company with under 500 people and you take a PPP loan for under $2 million, you could say you need the money, even if you don't, and just pocket more money, which Peter Schiff argues is exactly what a lot of wealthy companies did, like accountants and law firms and hedge funds. Since the Federal Reserve backstops these loans, this is really like money going directly from the Federal Reserve's printer and putting money into the economy through rich people who are mostly throwing it into the stock market. Peter Schiff thinks that this is the biggest fraud of a program that we have ever seen, and that any jobs we've created from the PPP wouldn't have really been lost anyway. And as soon as PPP funds dry up, any jobs that did get held onto will just end up disappearing anyway. Now, here's my interjection. He's actually not terribly wrong about the PPP. The PPP first required that you rehire employees in order to have the loan be free money during this pandemic. But that restriction has almost entirely been waived through Phase 3.5 that Congress passed, basically allowing you to have your loan forgiven as long as you tried to rehire people. And remember, loans under $2 million are deemed to have been made in good faith, so they don't get audited anyway. And now, the big problem is Peter thinks the American middle class is going to pay the biggest price ever. They're going to pay a massive inflation tax. No, he doesn't think that our money is going to go away. He thinks we'll still have our money in, our retirement accounts or our savings accounts or whatever. But he worries that the average person's money won't be able to buy as much as it did before, because the Fed is printing all of this money and is really borrowing money from the future to give it to us now, except rather than giving it to us equally, it's just giving the money to the wealthy people who own stocks and real estate. So, in general, this is how borrowing works after all. We borrow today to move our spending up to today. And this does a couple things. One, well, as expected, it makes the rich richer. People who already own stocks and real estate do really well in the long term, especially if they borrow money to buy stocks or real estate, because when interest rates are really low and the government's printing money like crazy, it's really easy to borrow money, it's really easy to invest money, and you put all the money into real estate and stocks. Then when inflation sets in, it actually becomes easier to pay off the loan. And this is very true. Here's sort of my interjection as an example of this. Let's say today you can lock in a home loan for 2.75% in many cases, and inflation is basically zero. Well, if I lock in that loan at 2.75% on $500K, and then inflation kicks in of, let's say, 3% or 4%, then the value of rents that I'm getting for that house will likely go up by at least that 3 to 4%. Which will also push up the value of my house. When rents go up, the values of real estate go up. So now all of a sudden here you experience that inflation, but who actually experiences it? The tenants. But what about the owner? Oh wait, they have a 30-year fixed rate loan at 2.75%. But now they're getting more rent and their costs are the same. They could take that more rent and pay off their loan more easily. And so now the people who own the assets get richer, and the tenants and the individuals that don't own assets get screwed. This is why inflation helps the rich. I talk about this concept in depth in my real estate investing course. This is exactly why real estate is one of the best investments you can make, especially early on when you're beginning to build wealth. However, Peter says the middle class gets screwed no matter what, unless they own assets. Now, Peter Schiff and I will disagree on what kind of assets. We'll talk about that in a bit. But Peter warns that anybody with credit card debt or student loan debt or consumer debt is basically going to get screwed. Why? Because anytime you have consumer debt and inflation kicks in, it's harder for you to survive with the money you have, so you have less money available to pay your debts, which actually make it harder for you to pay off your consumer debts. The only reason debt in real estate is different is because the value of your asset and your rents is going up in the longer term. It kind of goes up with the tide of inflation, and your payment stays fixed. This is why the rich get richer. Peter says the best thing to do is to reduce taxes and reduce government. And that's going to limit the odds of having a hyperinflationary bubble that's going to burst and destroy everything. Because after all, if businesses have less regulation, then they're able to spend and the market can regulate itself. This is exactly why Peter Schiff says the average American is going to get decimated because of our large government. So when it comes to what Peter recommends, he says the best thing to do is to reduce taxes and reduce the size of government, to let business spend the way business wants and let the market in general regulate itself. Now, this is my interjection. This concept that Peter Schiff is talking about is frequently brought up. It's a very laissez-faire approach, which is just a fancy way of saying the free hand. Laissez-faire was a principle that was really popularized by Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. Laissez-faire also means letting the market regulate itself. That's the concept, essentially. And now, of course, a totally free market can create problems. But Peter Schiff says, now with the internet, creating problems with the free market might actually be less of an issue, and that capitalism might be able to regulate itself. See, he argues that with the government, you don't have the choice to do business with the government. You have to do business with the government. You are forced to pay taxes. However, if you do business with a company and they suck, you leave them a bad review and you don't go back. That's how the market today can more easily regulate itself. However, because in Peter's opinion, the bubble is already so big, the only way we can really reduce this bubble is to raise interest rates, temporarily hurt and deflate this crazy bubble we're in, like weaning a baby off a bottle, and then go back to a normal economy. Peter, in the meantime, advocates we invest in gold. Now, in fairness, gold is Peter's probably main investment vehicle. Peter Schiff is a money manager. I'm sure he invests in plenty of other things as well, but he's huge on selling gold. In fact, ever since I've been making YouTube videos, I've been commenting, and sometimes I even sort of clip Peter Schiff in when I talk about gold, because I almost think of gold and Peter Schiff as one and the same. Peter's the gold seller. But I'm making this video because he's got an interesting concept here. So let's keep going on that, and I'll make it clear when you're getting my personal opinion, as I have been doing. Now, just to be clear, I personally do not invest in gold. I don't own any gold. I stick to stocks and real estate. But even though Peter and I might disagree on what we chose to invest in, Peter would probably look at somebody like me and say, okay, that's fine. You're the dude who's going to be okay when the bubble pops, because you'll still have assets when there's high inflation. Sure, the value of those assets might go down, but it becomes easier to pay off debt. As long as you're not over leveraged, you're okay with assets. You've got assets. But what about the 99% of people who don't have a lot of assets? They're the ones who are going to get screwed, and maybe buying gold is right for them. That's Peter's opinion, that buying gold is right for them, that would be a store of value. Okay, everybody can make their own conclusion. This is not a video about gold. But let's keep moving on with Peter's argument, because he does have some very interesting arguments. Peter says that the beautiful thing about letting businesses operate freely is that they can choose through charity to help whomever they want. They don't have to get taxed ridiculously where the money goes into an inefficient government. And the government, when you look at the government's never known for efficiency. You create one department that becomes redundant for another department. And the government didn't create technologies like a lot of the technologies we use now. Like, we don't use WhatsApp to talk to people in China from America because the United States government came up with it. Instead, the market comes up with these things. The market does things better, cheaper, and more efficiently. Peter Schiff even says that private charities do better than the government. The discussion then shifts to minimum wage. Joe Rogan asks, but come on, people need help. What about minimum wage? What about a livable wage? Shouldn't the government provide a livable wage? This is obviously an extremely touchy subject, and I'm just going to summarize Peter Schiff's argument here, so don't hate on me. Peter Schiff says that the minimum wage hurts workers. See, if a worker produces $8 of value, but the government mandates that a company produce or pay that worker $10 of value, then the company loses $2 per hour because they're getting $8 of value, but they're paying $10 an hour for it. This explains why now, in Peter's opinion, we talk to so many robots when we pick up the phone to call tech support, or we call people in India. It just doesn't make sense for a company to pay $10 an hour for $8 an hour of service. So instead, companies find ways to automate and to replace the worker, which in Peter's opinion ends up screwing the worker. Joe Rogan says, but come on, how's someone supposed to survive on minimum wage? And Peter Schiff argues that people are not supposed to survive on minimum wage. Minimum wage used to be for teenagers to do basic jobs and get life experience. That's why so many of us as teenagers got tips when we were working at a restaurant or like gas station attendees. And guess what? Gas station attendees pumped your gas. They cleaned your window. They tried to provide a service. They learned customer service and they got tipped or they didn't get tipped based on their service or based on the marketplace. Maybe those workers, the gas station attendees, in the meantime, when nobody's at the station, they'd go hang out with the mechanic and learn how to be a mechanic. See, in Peter's mind, until you learn to create more value with your skill set, that is, until you learn more skills, you won't be able to make more money. This is actually something that I talk a lot about in my money and stock course, where I talk about the psychology of money. That if you want to invest and build wealth, you got to figure out how to grow the top line, not about saving every little penny and every little Starbucks. You got to figure out how to build more skill sets to grow the top line. That's the most important. Sure, that doesn't mean don't be frugal. Being frugal is great, but you're not going to frugal yourself to millionaire and retired. Peter Schiff says it's impossible to make more money without learning more skills. It doesn't work that way. And it makes sense to not pay somebody more unless they're actually providing more value. So if you want to earn more, learn more, Peter says. That's how the market works, in his opinion. Joe Rogan worries, though, that that's tough love. And Peter Schiff says it is. But the only thing that actually creates a properly functioning economy, in his opinion, is a world in which everybody can benefit by providing more value, not a world in which the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting screwed, especially by what Peter believes is coming and big inflation, thanks to the rich taking all of the funny printed money and investing it and everybody else getting screwed. He does, though, defend Wall Street. He says, remember, Wall Street is not to blame. The government is to blame. Schiff says that the government just makes things worse, and that because of that, socialism is winning. He believes socialism is winning now because capitalism wasn't given a fair chance. Because capitalism wasn't given a fair chance, because it was so heavily regulated, it makes it seem like capitalism is bad and that the answer is socialism, when instead, all that does is promote socialism, which potentially leads to more and bigger, inefficient government. He believes more government creates more problems, not less, and says this is exactly why socialism eventually fails. Yet capitalism can really only work with a small government. Otherwise, you create massive bubbles that end up screwing people who do not have the assets like stocks and real estate. On his final point, Peter Schiff mentions that college has gotten obscenely more expensive because of the existence of student loans. He says that with student loans, for example, you end up artificially raising the price of college because colleges spend more on things like gyms and beautiful amenities to attract more of that loan money. Since interest rates are artificially low and people with no credit and no borrowing experience are literally given student loans to massive sums, people just borrow money like crazy, and then guess what happens? Everyone ends up with a college degree. And now, a college degree doesn't even mean anything anymore, in Peter Schiff's opinion. For a degree to mean something, you have to have a master's degree or a PhD now, which explains why people with bachelor's degrees are waiting tables, in Peter Schiff's opinion. Yet, now, those same people waiting tables have $50,000 in student debt. Or if they're lucky, they maybe are able to pay that off in 5 or 10 years, which actually demotivates people from trying to make more money. In fact, I'm going to interject here and say there is a very real demotivation that student loans create. There are a lot of people who graduate college and realize, okay, so all I have to do is pay the minimum on my student loans for 20 years and they get forgiven, and I pay based on what my income is? Well, I'll just keep my income low and then get those loans forgiven, which is honestly, in my opinion, a very sad way to look at it, but that's real. That happens. Let's go back to Peter Schiff. Peter Schiff says college keeps getting more expensive because the government keeps making it easier and easier to borrow more and more money. In the corporate world, this is the same thing that's happening. The government makes it easier and easier to borrow money, and now zombie companies that should be dead and deserve to die are getting bailed out, and they're staying to absorb more resources in a market that they shouldn't even exist in. All right, well, that's a lot. Now, here are my thoughts. I do personally believe that the private market is more efficient than the government. However, I also believe that there's a balance that calls for more support from the government, especially in times like these, like during the pandemic. I also believe that some regulation is very important. Like, if we didn't have standard accounting principles, it'd be very difficult to value stocks and companies against each other because everybody might use different practices. Whereas the SEC comes in and tries to level the playing field and make sure that, every company's not necessarily a good investment, but at least they're an honest investment. That doesn't mean every investment is honest, but at least we have some regulation to somewhat help us. Peter Schiff might disagree, but Peter Schiff also argues for saving more money, which isn't bad advice. However, his suggestion and his main takeaway for the average everyday listener is that right now we should be worried about rampant inflation coming, and that inflation is going to destroy the 99%. It's going to be very, very painful for a lot of people. Peter Schiff's goal is to invest in gold and recommends that you invest in gold or something to preserve your wealth. My goal is to continue to buy stocks and real estate anytime I can when I think stocks are on sale or when I buy real estate below market value, which I teach you how to do in my programs down below. And I also teach you how to make YouTube videos like this in my YouTube course, which is on pre-sale and releasing on August 10th. But in the meantime, I do also recognize that if high inflation comes and then interest rates follow, both stocks and real estate will get hurt in the short term due to inflation. So some balance of gold may not be a horrible idea. I'm not going to do that because eventually, in the longer term, assets tend to rise with inflation, and oftentimes more than inflation. However, everyone without stocks or real estate, I think Peter Schiff and I can agree. If you don't own stocks, you don't own real estate, you don't own gold, you could potentially get really hurt when inflation starts kicking in. Well, there you have it. Check out the YouTube course, the money course, and the real estate course in the links down below. Thank you so much for watching this. And folks, we will see you next time.